We begin, as we always do, with the plain truth of a life that had been worn down to almost nothing. She was 52 years old, standing in the mud of a dying Wyoming town with $11 sewn into the hem of her only good dress, and nowhere left to go. Her husband's brother, a hard man named Corwin Mercer who had never once looked her in the eye at supper, had put her off the family land the week after the burial, saying a widow with no sons had no claim to a working farm. All she carried out of 30 years of marriage was a trunk, a rifle her husband had taught her to clean, and that $11. So when she heard that the old blacksmith shop at the end of Coldwater Bend's main road was being sold for $4 because no one wanted it, black and hollow-eyed as it was, folks said she had lost her senses entirely. A woman alone, buying a ruin nobody else would touch. They laughed behind their hands at the church social. But what she found beneath the forge floor that autumn would not only save her, it would settle a debt the whole town had been carrying, unknowingly, for 11 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Mercer. If you are watching this from a town that time seems to have forgotten, or from a place where you've ever felt written off the way Eliza was, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, we read every one. Eliza had been born Eliza Doyle, in a river town in Missouri, the daughter of a wheelwright who believed there was no shame in a girl learning a trade with her hands. While other fathers sent their daughters off to needlework and hymnals, Patrick Doyle kept his youngest at his elbow in the wheel shop, teaching her to read the grain of oak, to know by touch alone whether a spoke would hold a wagon's weight or splinter under the first hard mile. She grew up with sawdust in her hair and the smell of hot iron in her nose, because her father's shop shared a wall with the town smithy, and old Ansel Fortier, the smith, had taken a shine to the quiet girl who asked good questions and never flinched at the sparks. By the time she was 12, Eliza could bank a forge fire so it held its heat through a cold night. By 16, she understood the difference between wrought iron and cast, could tell you why a blade quenched too fast would crack, and had absorbed, without ever being told it was unusual, an entire trade that most women of her time were never permitted near. It was her father who gave her the words she would carry the rest of her life, spoken to her once while they sanded down a wagon wheel together in the lamplight. Most folks only value a thing for what it looks like today, Eliza. You learn to see what a thing is worth underneath, and you'll never go hungry, even when the world tells you that you ought to. She did not understand it then. As a girl of 14 with flower-white hands and impatience in her heart, she would understand it fully only decades later, kneeling in the dirt of an abandoned forge with a crowbar in her hands. She married Daniel Mercer at 20, a gentle, unhurried man from a farming family out west, and she followed him first to Nebraska and then, after a hard winter, took 2 of their cattle and nearly took Daniel's toes to frostbite, further out to the Wyoming territory, to a modest spread of land near a town called Coldwater Bend, named for the icy creek that cut along its western edge. They never had children who lived past infancy, 2 sons, both gone before their first birthdays, a grief Eliza carried quietly and never spoke of unless asked directly, and even then only in a few careful words. What she and Daniel built instead was a partnership of 2 people who understood work as a form of love. She kept the books. She doctored the animals. She could shoe a horse herself when Daniel's hip acted up in wet weather, a skill the neighbor women found faintly scandalous and the neighbor men found quietly useful, especially the ones too proud to say so aloud. Daniel used to tell people, with unmistakable pride, that his wife had more iron sense than half the smiths between here and Cheyenne. It was the sort of thing a man says lightly at a dinner table, never knowing how literally his own family would test the truth of it one day. Daniel Mercer died in the spring, thrown from a spooked horse while mending fence along the northern boundary of their land, 3 days before his 51st birthday. Eliza found him at dusk when he did not come in for supper. She was 51 herself that year, and in the space of one evening, she went from being half of a partnership to being, in the eyes of the law and the eyes of her husband's family, nothing at all, because the land, as it turned out, had never been put fully in both their names. It had passed, upon Daniel's death, into a trust controlled by his older brother Corwin, a cold, calculating man who had resented Daniel's marriage from the start. Believing Eliza had married beneath, or rather, that Daniel had married beneath, a wheelwright's daughter with dirt under her nails and no family money behind her. Corwin wasted no time. Within a month of the funeral, he informed Eliza, without a flicker of shame, that the land was needed for his own growing family, and that she would need to make other arrangements. He offered her exactly what the law required and not a cent more, the $11 that had technically been listed as her personal effects in Daniel's estate, plus permission to keep her trunk, her rifle, and the clothes on her back. She did not beg. That was not in her nature, and it would not have moved Corwin Mercer regardless. She simply packed the trunk her mother had given her, said a private goodbye to the fence line Daniel had died mending, and walked into Coldwater Bend proper with everything she owned loaded onto a borrowed cart driven by a sympathetic neighbor boy who would not meet her eyes the whole ride. Ashamed on behalf of a family that was not even his own. Coldwater Bend in the autumn of 1879 was not a thriving place. It had once hoped to become a railway town, and for a few years in the early 70s it had swelled with that hope. A hotel had gone up, a proper mercantile, even talk of a bank. But the rail line had gone 20 miles south instead, following easier ground, and the town had been left to wither slowly, the way so many almost towns did in that country. Half the buildings on the main road stood empty. The hotel had become a boarding house run by a widow named Sarah Voss, tired and kind, who let Eliza a small room on credit for the first week out of simple human decency. The mercantile still ran, owned by a stern but fair man named Otto Reinhold. And at the very end of the road, past the last standing storefronts, sat the blacksmith shop, dark, roof sagging on one corner, door hanging by a single hinge. The whole structure looking as though the town itself had simply forgotten it was there. It had belonged, Eliza learned within her first days in town, to a smith named Elias Whitfield, who had died 11 years earlier in a fire that gutted half the shop and killed him where he stood at his own forge. No one had ever quite explained to Eliza's satisfaction why the fire had started, or why Whitfield's own family, a wife and daughter who had, by all accounts, left Coldwater Bend within a year of his death and never returned, had abandoned the property outright rather than sell it. The shop had simply sat there for over a decade, its ownership eventually reverting to the county for unpaid taxes. Its price falling year after year as no one showed the slightest interest in a scorched building with a dead man's ghost said to linger in it. Eliza had $11. She needed shelter, and she needed a way to make a living that did not depend on the charity of a town that owed her nothing. She had spent 3 days walking past that ruined shop on her way to and from the boarding house, and each time she passed, something in her would not let her look away, not superstition, not sentiment, but the plain, trained eye of a wheelwright's daughter who had learned as a girl to see what a thing was worth underneath its ruin. She went to the county clerk, a nervous young man named Prescott who seemed almost embarrassed by the transaction, and she bought the old Whitfield blacksmith shop, forge and all, for $4. The laughter followed quickly. Otto Reinhold, not unkindly, told her she'd have been wiser to spend the $4 on flour. 2 women outside the church remarked, just loudly enough for her to hear, that a widow ought to know her place better than to go playing at a man's trade in a burnt-out ruin. Sarah Voss alone did not laugh, only studied Eliza's face for a long moment and said, quietly, Whitfield was a good man. Whatever you find in there, you treat it gentle. Eliza did not know, at the time, how strange and how prophetic that sentence would prove to be. She moved into the shop's small back room, the one part of the structure the fire had spared, and she began to clear the wreckage with her own 2 hands, sweeping ash, hauling out collapsed timber, scrubbing soot from the one window that had not shattered. It was slow, filthy, solitary work, and it was during that work, on her 4th day, prying up a section of scorched flooring near the base of the forge itself to check for rot beneath, that her crowbar struck something that was not wood at all, a flat iron plate, deliberately set into the earth beneath the forged stones, bearing on its surface, faint under a decade of grime, the scratched initials EW. Her hands went still. A blacksmith did not bury an iron plate under his own forge floor by accident, and he did not do it for no reason. She worked the plate free with the same patience her father had taught her for coaxing a stubborn wool spoke loose without cracking the hub, and beneath it she found not treasure, not yet, but a narrow iron box, rusted at its seams, wedged into a shallow dugout space in the hard-packed earth. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and dark with age, was a single folded letter, and beneath that, a leather ledger, its cover swollen with old damp but its pages, remarkably still legible. She did not open the ledger that first night. She sat with the letter by candlelight in her small back room, her heart working strangely in her chest, and she read words that had been waiting 11 years for someone to find them. The letter was written in a careful, unhurried hand, dated some 6 months before the fire that killed him, and addressed to no one in particular, the private accounting of a man who perhaps feared, even then, that he might not live to say these things aloud. Elias Whitfield wrote that he had, over the course of nearly a decade, served as the unofficial keeper of the town's building fund, money raised by subscription from every family in Coldwater Bend during the hopeful railroad years, meant to build a proper schoolhouse and a permanent well system for the town, since the creek ran low and foul every third summer. The fund had been entrusted informally to Whitfield, of all people, not the bank, because the town's one attempt at a bank had folded within a year of opening, its owner absconding with what little capital remained, and the townsfolk had decided, in the bitter aftermath, that they trusted iron and a blacksmith's word more than they trusted paper and a banker's promises. Whitfield had kept the fund safe in gold and silver coin, adding to it as subscriptions came in, recording every contribution meticulously in the ledger, intending to see the schoolhouse and the well built once the sum was sufficient. But in the months before his death, the letter went on, Whitfield had grown afraid of a man named Silas Crane, who had arrived in Coldwater Bend 2 years earlier claiming to be a banker of good standing from the East, and who had been, with increasing insistence, pressuring the town council to let him establish a proper bank and take the building fund under his management. Whitfield did not trust him. He wrote that Crane's numbers never quite added up when compared against his own promises, that Crane had twice been seen in low conversation with men who were not, by any account, bankers of any kind. Whitfield had refused, publicly and repeatedly, to hand the fund over, which had made him, in the final months of his life, a man with a powerful enemy. The letter ended with a single unfinished line, as though he had meant to return to it and never had the chance. If anything should happen to me before the schoolhouse stands, let whoever finds this know the fund is not lost, only hidden, and that it belongs to Coldwater Bend, not to any one man's name. Eliza sat a long while with that letter in her lap, the candle guttering low, and understood with a cold, creeping certainty that Elias Whitfield had not died by simple accident. The ledger, when she finally worked up the nerve to open it fully the following night, confirmed everything the letter implied and more. Page after page recorded contributions from families whose names Eliza now recognized from the boarding house register and the mercantile's counter, the Reinholds, the Vossas, the Pruitts. A full accounting stretching back 9 years, some small and large, all totaled with a craftsman's precision. And tucked into the ledger's final pages, in ink that had clearly been added later than the rest, in a hand grown hurried and uneven, were notes that read less like bookkeeping and more like a man watching a door he feared would open. Names. Dates. An entry noting that Crane had visited the shop twice in 1 week asking pointed questions about where a man might keep that kind of money safe. A final entry, dated only 3 days before the fire, that said simply, "He knows I have it under the forge. Moving it is no longer safe. God keep this town, whatever comes." Eliza understood, then, sitting alone in a dead man's shop with his 11-year-old fear laid open across her lap, that she was holding not a windfall but a wound the town had never known it carried. Somewhere beneath her own boots, if Whitfield's careful hiding had held against fire and time, lay the actual fund itself, gold and silver enough to build the schoolhouse and the well that Coldwater Bend had been quietly, achingly doing without for over a decade. blaming its own poverty and bad luck rather than ever suspecting it had been robbed of its own future. She spent 3 more days searching before she found it, not beneath the iron plate itself, which she now understood had been a decoy of sorts. A place obvious enough to satisfy a searching eye without giving up the true cache, but behind the forge's rear wall. Inside a false chimney flue Whitfield had built with a stonemason's cunning disguised as ordinary repair work. Wrapped in 3 layers of oiled canvas, protected even from the fire that had killed its keeper, sat a strongbox containing coin. Carefully counted and recorded to match the ledger almost to the dollar, along with a deed of trust Whitfield had drawn up privately, naming no single owner, only the people of Coldwater Bend. Held by whoever keeps faith with this forge. Word does not stay quiet long in a small town. And Eliza was neither foolish nor secretive enough to try to keep such a discovery entirely to herself. Once she understood its scale, she went first to Sarah Voss, whose steadiness she had come to trust, and together they went to the county clerk, young Prescott, to have the discovery properly witnessed and recorded before anyone could later claim it had been tampered with or invented. But secrets travel faster than honesty, and within a week, Silas Crane, still very much a presence in Coldwater Bend, now respected as a founding partner of the small private lending office that had replaced the town's failed bank, arrived at the blacksmith shop's broken door with 2 hired men and a claim of his own. That the fund, if it existed, had always been intended for proper banking management, that Whitfield had been, in Crane's carefully rehearsed telling, an unstable and possessive man who had likely stolen the subscription money outright rather than safeguarded it, and that as the only qualified financial man left in town, the fund's rightful disposition now fell to him. It might have worked, 11 years earlier, on a town too grieved and too trusting to question a well-dressed man's confidence. It did not work on Eliza Mercer, who had spent 3 days memorizing every entry in Elias Whitfield's careful ledger and who recognized, the moment Crane began speaking, that his account did not match a single one of the dead man's own words. She did not shout. She did not accuse him outright, not yet, understanding with her father's old patience that a claim made too early, without proof laid plainly before witnesses, could be twisted and denied. Instead, she asked Otto Reinhold, whose own family's contribution was recorded in Whitfield's ledger down to the dollar and the date, to come and see the pages for himself. She asked Sarah Voss to do the same. She sent word, through Prescott, that any family in town who wished to examine the ledger and compare it against their own memory of what they had once given toward the schoolhouse fund was welcome to come to the shop and look with their own eyes. They came, slowly, over the following days, families who had half forgotten their own small sacrifices toward a school and a well that had never materialized, families who had, without quite realizing it, absorbed Crane's quiet suggestion over the years that the fund had simply been badly managed and lost, a shameful subject not worth revisiting. They read Whitfield's hand. They saw their own names, their own contributions, dated and totaled exactly as they remembered giving them. And they read, too, the final hurried entries, the fear, the visits, the door Whitfield had watched with such dread in the last days of his life. Crane's confidence, so effective against a grieving town 11 years earlier, curdled quickly under the weight of a dead man's own careful handwriting laid out before the very families he had tried, in his final months, to protect. Crane did not go quietly. He threatened Eliza with legal action over the property itself, arguing that a woman with no formal claim beyond a $4 county purchase had no standing to distribute funds of that size. And for a tense stretch of weeks it seemed the matter might drag through territorial courts for years, the funds sitting locked and useless while lawyers argued over technicalities. Exactly the outcome that would have suited Crane best, buying him time to muddy the record further or simply wait the town's attention out. It was Eliza's own steadiness, and the deed Whitfield had so carefully worded, that turned the matter. The trust document named no individual owner, only whoever kept faith with the forge, a phrase Prescott, to his credit, argued before the Territorial Land Office meant precisely what it said. That ownership of the fund's disposition rested with the shop's rightful, lawful possessor, acting in good faith on behalf of the community named in the ledger itself. Eliza had bought the shop honestly, at public sale, for $4, with no fraud and no concealment. She had, the moment she understood what she held, brought it forward openly rather than quietly pocketing it. That, more than any lawyer's argument, was what turned the town's sentiment fully against Crane and fully toward her, family by family. As more of them came to sit with the ledger and recognize their own dead hopes recorded faithfully in a dead man's hand. The final undoing came not from Eliza at all, but from an old freight ledger Otto Reinhold still kept from the failed bank years, which, once compared against Crane's own lending office records, showed a pattern of small, unexplained withdrawals routed through accounts under names no one in Coldwater Bend recognized, the same pattern, Prescott noted grimly, that had likely emptied the town's first failed bank a decade earlier, long before Crane had ever announced himself a respectable financier fresh from the East. Whether Crane had been the very man responsible for that first theft, or simply a partner to it who had returned years later under a cleaner name to try again for a fund he already knew existed, no one could prove with full certainty, and Eliza, true to the plain fairness her father had raised her with, never claimed more than the evidence supported. But it was enough. Enough for the territorial marshal to take a long, serious interest in Silas Crane's lending records. Enough for Crane to quietly close his office within the month and leave Coldwater Bend before the marshal's second visit. Never to be seen in that country again, not dragged off in chains for a dramatic reckoning, but simply exposed, thoroughly and publicly. Until the town he had hoped to quietly rob a second time wanted nothing more to do with him. It was, Eliza thought, watching his wagon disappear down the south road, exactly the kind of justice her own father would have recognized, not loud, not violent. Simply the truth finally weighed correctly against the false face a man had worn for years. What Eliza did next was the part of the story the town would tell for a generation afterward. She did not take a single coin of the recovered fund for herself, though she was owed, by any reasonable measure, a considerable finder's share, and more than one family urged her to accept one. Instead, she called a town meeting in the newly reopened Mercantile, the first real gathering Coldwater Bend had held in years, and laid Whitfield's ledger and 10 years of quiet arithmetic out plainly before everyone, proposing that the fund be used exactly as its original givers had intended, a schoolhouse, and a proper well to see the town through its worst dry summers. She asked only one thing for herself, and it was not money. She asked that the blacksmith shop remain hers to work, rebuilt as a proper forge, and that Elias Whitfield's name be placed on a plaque above the schoolhouse door, so that the man who had died protecting a town's small, ordinary hopes would not remain, as he had for 11 years, an unmarked ghost at the end of an empty road. The schoolhouse rose the following spring, timber by timber, with half the town turning out on weekends to raise its frame. And the well was dug deep enough that summer to run clear and cold even in the driest August anyone in Coldwater Bend could remember. Eliza Mercer stood at her own forge through most of that work, shoeing the draft horses that hauled the lumber, mending the tools that broke under heavy use, earning her keep the same honest way her father had taught her decades earlier in a wheelwright's shop half a country away, by seeing worth where others saw only ruin, and by being willing to do the patient work of proving it. So we return, as we always do, to where we began, a 52-year-old widow, cast off by her own husband's family, standing in the mud with $11 and nowhere to go. Laughed at for spending 4 of those dollars on a burnt, forgotten shop nobody else wanted. It would have been easy, and understandable, for Eliza Mercer to have kept what she found beneath that forge floor entirely for herself. No one would have blamed her. Not after what Corwin Mercer had done, not after a decade of the world underestimating a woman with dirt under her nails and no family fortune behind her. But that was never who she was, not as a girl learning her father's trade, not as a wife building a partnership out of quiet daily work, and not as a widow standing alone at the edge of a dying town. She saw what a thing was worth underneath, the way her father had taught her, and she understood that the truest worth of what she'd found was never the gold itself, but the chance it gave her to keep faith, with a dead man's fear, with a town's forgotten hopes, and with the plain, unglamorous belief that patient, honest work eventually settles its own accounts. Coldwater Bend did not simply survive because of what Eliza Mercer found under that forge. It was restored, root and rafter, because of who she chose to be once she found it. Thank you for spending this time with Eliza's story, and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that worth is often hidden in the places the world has already written off. We'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something, or someone, that everyone else had dismissed too quickly? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories often become the seeds of the ones we tell next. Until next time, stay close.